Okay, thank you all very much indeed for coming. Let's make a start. My name's Jo Casebourne and I'm a Programme Director here at the Institute for Government and I lead our work on English devolution, so delighted to have you all today for this event. Just a bit of housekeeping before we start. We're not planning any fire drills today, so if the fire alarm does go off, please follow myself and colleagues down the main stairs where you came in. We also very much hope that you will join the conversation on Twitter, so please tweet away using the hashtag #DevoDeals for devolution deals. And I'd also very much like to thank the Gatsby Foundation for the support of our work at the Institute on English devolution, and particular to Jennifer Burden and colleagues who are here today who have very much helped form a key part of this work that we've been doing. So just a few remarks from me before I introduce the panel. As you all know, after the new Conservative government was elected last May, one of the Chancellor's very first announcements was that he would be pushing ahead with a devolution drive, and he reiterated that a devolution deal would be on offer to cities willing to adopt directly elected mayors. And this agenda then really picked up the pace after that with the announcement of the devolution deal for Cornwall in July. And following the summer budget, areas were invited to submit proposals by a deadline of the 4th of September. So there was a very busy summer for many people in local areas putting together their proposals for that deadline. And they would then feed into the spending review process. And we were surprised to see that 38 bids were received by that September the 4th deadline. And we then saw in the run-up to the spending review some further deals announced for Sheffield City Region, the North East, Tees Valley, the West Midlands and Liverpool. And around that time in September, the Prime Minister's speech calling for a smarter state also had English devolution as one of its key themes. And we've also seen since then the Cities and Local Government Devolution Bill received royal assent at the end of January and is now an act. And we're awaiting with bated breath to see the next round of deals announced, perhaps in the run-up to the budget or at the budget. So what we're hoping to look at today really is the role of Whitehall in all of this. As we're seeing more power being devolved to local places, what does that mean for how Whitehall needs to think about itself? So I'm hoping that we might cover questions like how Whitehall is going to manage its relationships with local places, what role the Treasury will continue to play, particularly as we move into implementation, and will they be there to help kind of unblock blockages and champion in the deals with other departments? And does it mean that Whitehall will be doing less if we're devolving power to local areas? Will we see civil servants relocating to cities and counties around the country? Or will Whitehall have a role in sharing the learning between those places as people are experimenting with new ways of delivering public services and promoting local growth? So that's enough from me, but those are some of the issues that I hope we're going to cover today. But I'm now going to introduce you to our panel. So first of all, to my left is Joe Randall, who is a researcher here at the Institute for Government, and he is the lead author of our guide to devolution, Making Devolution Deals Work, that again was done in partnership with the Gatsby Foundation. Next up is Dr. Sarah Ayres, who is Reader in Public Policy and Governance at the University of Bristol, where her central research interest is the governance of place, space and territory. And Sarah has recently chaired the Political Studies Association's first research commission looking at the role of informal governance in English devolution, and she'll be talking about some of that today. Next up is Tom Walker, who is Director of the Cities and Local Growth Team at CLG and has been since April 2014. And before this, Tom was a Deputy Director for Enterprise Zones at CLG, worked in various roles at CLG, the Home Office and the Cabinet Office. And last but very means not least, Will, who's arrived just in the nick of time, I'm glad to see, who is Deputy Director of Local Government and Reform of Public Services at the Treasury. And Will has previously been Deputy Director of Growth and Economic Affairs at the Cabinet Office and has worked in various roles in the Treasury and the Foreign Office as well. So we're going to start by just hearing briefly from each of our panellists. I will be ruthless and cut them off if they run over time. And we're going to start by hearing from Joe about the Devolution Deals Guide that we developed here at the Institute. So I will hand over to Joe.
Okay, so I thought I would give you a bit of background as well as the guide itself. So I'm aiming to do 3 sets of 3 reflections, so 3 opportunities we think are associated with devolution, 3 strengths that we see in the current process, and 3 key questions that the IFG thinks that Whitehall needs to answer about its role in the future. So first, a bit of background. The Institute has worked on English devolution for a number of years now, beginning with a focus back in the early days of IFG on directly elected mayors, shifting to a focus before the 2015 general election on how the political parties could deliver on their manifesto pledges to devolve power, and then more recently our focus on the current devolution deal-making process and our guide that I'll talk through in a bit to making this type of devolution more effective in the future. So why is the Institute interested in devolution? Well, first, governments often pledge to devolve power, and in the past they've rarely seen able to deliver on those pledges. But second, lots of people's arguments in favour of devolution revolve around claims that it could lead to more effective government, obviously very important to us here at the Institute. And it's worth saying that although the evidence for these benefits is contested and often patchy, there are 3 key opportunities that we think form the basis of most of those arguments in favour. So first, lots of people argue that devolution will enable government to boost economic growth and productivity by better aligning economic policy levers with functional economic areas. Second, lots of people argue that devolution makes it easier to join up and reform public services, which could unlock efficiencies due to closer working across policy and service silos locally, but it could also lead to a simpler, clearer landscape of public services for citizens. And then the third key opportunity that lots of people argue for is that devolution could increase innovation and experimentation in public services, with smaller, more localised services better able to change, fail and adapt than larger, uniform national systems. So, as Jo outlined, the government is attempting to realise these opportunities through the negotiation of bespoke devolution deals between central government departments and local areas. And through that process, we've seen deals signed with 8 areas already, or at least that's what I count. And our latest project, which we conducted in partnership with the Gatsby Foundation, looked in detail at the challenges and opportunities associated with that deal-making process. And during that research, which began as a project looking specifically at the devolution of skills funding and policy, and was then broadened out to include other policy areas as well, we interviewed more than 30 people in various cities and regions, central government, business and research organisations. And from all that work, we identified 3 key strengths in the current process of devolution deals. So first, unlike many devolution attempts in the past, this deal-making initiative is characterised by strong, clear political leadership, both from the Chancellor and the strong decentralising ministerial team of Greg Clark, James Wharton at DCLG, and also Jim O'Neill in the Treasury. Secondly, unlike past attempts as well, there's strong leadership of the current process in Whitehall. So new capacity in the Treasury with Will's team and others, and the latest incarnation of the Cities and Local Growth Unit, sitting across BIS and DCLG, together leading on deal negotiation and acting as an important support and challenge function for both local areas and for other Whitehall departments. And third, we think that the current process is good because it ties a promise of meaningful devolution to a demand for local governance reform. So the government has promised serious devolution of powers and budgets for areas that move to a new model of combined authority government, as well as adopting a directly elected mayor. However, our research, and as many others have also concluded recently, shows that the current process also comes with significant challenges. And in response to these, we developed a guide to effective devolution deals, which we hope will be useful for those leading devolution attempts and attempting to overcome these challenges in the future. So the guide suggests 4 sets of questions for policymakers and decision makers at both local and central levels to consider. The questions, it's important to note, are not supposed to be a comprehensive set of decision criteria, but they are intended to help both local and central actors to test and refine their plans. And the guide uses these questions to take decision makers through 4 distinct phases, which hopefully you can see up there. So the first is around setting up an effective deal-making process. The second is around assessing local areas' readiness for devolution. The third, assessing central government departments' readiness for devolution. And finally, sense-checking the results of devolution deals. We don't have time to go into all of those in detail, and actually lots of the areas in the guide go beyond the scope of today's discussion, but I would encourage you all to go and take a look at the guide after today's event. Instead of going through it in detail, what I'll do now is I'll run through 3 of the areas that our research indicated should be the key priorities for Whitehall to better prepare for future devolution deal-making. So first, we think there's a need for a clearer process and timeline for negotiating deals in the future. So as many have pointed out, the current process has been somewhat opaque, with a compressed timeline for negotiation, and many areas remain unclear about the next steps. So to us, an effective future deal-making process should allow sufficient time for robust local partnerships to develop. It should contain clearly communicated assessment criteria and objectives, and it should include clear milestones and deadlines. Second, we think there needs to be continuing high-level sponsorship and resourcing from departments that are able to push the devolution agenda within Whitehall. And quite practically, this means that the Treasury in particular will need to continue to play a championing and unblocking role within Whitehall as deals move from negotiation and through into implementation phases. And thirdly and finally, Whitehall needs to put in the work now to understand and plan for its new role within a more devolved system. So devolution deals will almost inevitably, by their very existence, reduce central government's direct authority in many areas. And departments will have to adapt their ways of working to suit the more complex policy landscape that's going to emerge from that. We're particularly interested in 2 aspects of that challenge. So first, the need to strengthen the capacity of Whitehall to manage centre local relationships day to day. And second, the need for Whitehall departments in general, and particularly those ones that in the past haven't had to engage with devolution conversations that much, to become more spatially aware, with a better understanding of the different and differential impacts of their policies on areas that in the future are going to have very different devolution settlements. So to conclude, I'd strongly recommend that you download, avidly read the guide, and please do get in touch with us to let us know what you think, as well as any areas you think that we've missed or that we can improve on in future iterations of this work.
Brilliant. Thanks very much, Jo. I'm going to pass on to Sarah next, please.
Thank you. Well, I'm here today in my capacity as chair of the Political Studies Association Research Commission, which has looked at the impact of informal governance on devolution to England's cities. The work, just by way of background, the work had its origins in some research I did in 2012, where I was looking to see how Whitehall departments were managing intergovernmental relationships under the new localism. Regions had gone, the standard templates had gone, and there was a question about how Whitehall departments was managing this melee of local governance structures coming up, which were confusing, ad hoc, and which were in flux. It wasn't the focus of my study at the time, but what came through really strongly when Whitehall officials were describing these relationships was informal, ad hoc, impromptu, needs must, trust, social relationships, personal relationships. And this prompted a number of questions in my mind. First was, if informality is having an increasing role in managing intergovernmental relations, how was this working in practice? Second, what were the implications of more informal ways of working for efficiency and effectiveness? How did this impact on the policy process? And third, what were the implications of informal governance for democracy, transparency, accountability, and audit of the policy process? So at the time, in 2012, my research suggested that the rise of informality was prompted by 2 key factors. First was the level of complexity around localism. It was very difficult to have standard procedures and bureaucracy to kick in when the policy environment was so in flux. And secondly, this idea that there had been big public sector spending cuts in Whitehall and local areas, so there was a reduction in state capacity to manage intergovernmental relations. So this led to the question about what stands in or steps in when the bureaucracy withdraws. It was this informal way of working. So informal governance that the Research Commission has looked at has been defined as a way of making decisions that are uncodified, non-institutional, and where social relationships and webs play crucial roles. So it's the layer of activity that happens beneath the formal archive, so there's no record of decision-making. So an example would be, as my capacity at Bristol University, if there's a tricky issue with a student or a member of staff, rather than start the decision-making process via a formal email or raise it in a meeting, I might pick up the phone and ask to speak to somebody. I might be motivated to do that for a number of reasons. Firstly, it might be about sidelining the formal bureaucracy, because I don't think the formal bureaucracy is going to help me. I don't want to work within it. It might be about working within the formal bureaucracy, complementing it in some way, but I'll agree a line of the way the decision has been made, and then I might formalise that then through an email or the formal meeting. So that's what we're trying to get at. What is the balance around the recent devolution deals between formal decision making and this informal layer of activity that takes place beneath the formal archive? Interestingly, in the literature, there's a tension between effectiveness in policy making and democracy. So policy making that pursues efficiency in terms of timely decision making, robust decisions made in a timely way, in a streamlined way. If you focus on that, it's very difficult to bring people with you in a consensual, democratic way. If you focus on democracy, transparency, and bringing everybody with you, it can undermine efficiency in policy making because you have a large numbers problem, it's difficult to get a consensus, it can be slow and burdensome. So what the Research Commission has tried to look at is what's the right balance around the devolution deals between streamlined, robust decision making, but also having a level of transparency and accountability in the policy process. After the election of the Conservative government in May last year, it became apparent that devolution was top on the agenda, or certainly a priority issue, and I was interested to see how informal governance was shaping the devolution debate. So as part of some different work I did, I was interviewing Whitehall colleagues, asking them about how they were managing intergovernmental relationships, the devolution deals, and their impacts, and how they were using informal governance. A number of observations which are quite pertinent. First is that this was a topic that was chiming with practitioners. I've done interviews in Whitehall over the last 15 years, and this was the first time that nobody said no. So there was a willingness to talk and articulate views about how informal governance was working. Second, I expected some quite awkward conversations about informal governance. How do you define it? How do you make the distinction between formal and informal? Could they identify it as part of their day-to-day working practices? Making the distinction academically and theoretically is really complicated and really challenging. So I was anticipating some awkwardness. But again, not. Practitioners, dynamic practitioners at the heart of this process, absolutely what I understood what I meant by the term informal governance. And they recognised that they were using more of it. They recognised that it was having an increasing role. And crucially, they were interested in understanding how it was working. So the reflexive practitioner wanted to understand more about this informal environment that they were increasingly working in. And this prompted my application to the Political Studies Association to do some work as part of the Commission. So the Commission has been a collaborative effort between think tanks, stakeholders. I've been working with Jo Casebourne, Institute for Government, forgive me, Jo. Mark Sanford, that was what confused me at the back, House of Commons Library. Paul Buddery, Royal Society of Arts, and Ed Cox from Institute IPPR. And has explored the impact of informal governance, both on the decision-making process, but also the implications for democracy. The academic literature argues that this informal way of working, that's fluid, can have real benefits in terms of timely decision-making, building trust between partners, innovation and entrepreneurship. This is especially true when senior bureaucrats have the support of elected politicians to go off script, to use informal governance. When politicians, elected politicians, are working in conjunction with senior bureaucrats off script, then there are real opportunities to drive forward policy process and look for innovation and entrepreneurship. So the Commission wasn't saying informal governance was bad, it was simply trying to understand how it had been used. On the other hand, the academic literature also says that informal governance can undermine transparency, accountability, social justice in the policy process, because it's really difficult to understand the formal audit of decision-making, track decisions and how they've been made. So informal governance is a feature of all bureaucracies or policy making, but the Commission argues that the devolution process has been characterised by a high level of informal governance. So only those arguably at the heart of the process know really what's going on and how decisions have been made. And there's an argument that this could perhaps undermine the democratic legitimacy and accountability of the devolution process. The Commission's findings and the people that spoke to us said that there are undoubtedly benefits to more informal ways of working. And those at the heart of the process were quite sceptical about the degree to which the process could be opened up to broader consultation. And there were comments where some of the value and the fluidity and the dynamism of relationships could be lost if you opened it up and tried to bring more people with you involved in the policy process. That said, there is a danger that devolution could be undermined or derailed if it doesn't secure local support, if the public are unaware of it, and if there's not local consensus and buy-in around devolution deals. A critical sticking point will be that success might be determined by turnout in mayoral elections, and if this topic doesn't begin to chime with the public, there could be low electoral turnout, and this could undermine the policy agenda. So the Commission has looked at the role of informal governance in some detail. The work has been based on a literature review and interviews with key stakeholders involved in the policy process. We have a number of findings, we have a number of recommendations that feature in the report. I won't go talk to them in any detail because I think lots of the issues that we raise actually come up in Jo and Jo's report being launched today. So that gives you a feel for the work of the Commission and what we've been trying to look at.
Brilliant, thanks very much,
Thank you,
Sarah.
Jo.
Tom.
Great. I am a senior bureaucrat. What a charming,
A dynamic one, I know.
what a charming term. So I'm going to, just to summarise my job, I'm in DCLG and Biz. Actually, I had a joint team at the heart of devolution deals, working very closely with Will. But I also have responsibility for a whole range of growth programmes as well as devolution deals. But I'm going to do three brief things. One, just give you a bit of the backstory, how we've got to where we got to. Secondly, talk about deals, because for me, the emphasis on the word deal is as important as the word devolution. And then thirdly, just a few things on Whitehall and heading up the joint unit. So why devolution and where did we start? I mean, I think the two backdrop points I'd like to make right at the very outset are, one, I think it's widely held that England is a hugely centralised system. So the appetite for devolution is well understood and I think well baked in. And then secondly, that means there are three things which when you come to hear a panel like this, you find not quite universal agreement, but a large degree of agreement. And that is the policy agenda has a consensus, I think, across the main parties, that politics itself is pointing in the direction of greater control and devolution, and that the reforms are very pro-market. So the market, particularly in our growth policy agenda, is not resistant to local leadership and local growth with the right conditions. The building blocks I thought I might just start, because it's important to remember that this agenda began in 2010, 2011, the fear of a triple dip recession, the government response to drive economic growth with a whole range of initiatives being rolled out. Started with local enterprise partnerships. Their role is transformed now compared to their launch just over 4 years ago. It morphed into city deals, so Greg Clark and Nick Clegg in a dialogue with the 8 core cities set out a prospectus that basically provided the menu of policy options that places could come to government and discuss bespoke solutions. Michael Heseltine then published his report, No Stone Unturned, and if you want the definitive guide, and lots of people do want the definitive guide to this agenda, I still think that is the single most authoritative text. It sets out the direction of travel, and I think you see it both in the Northern Powerhouse and actually a resurgence of interest in pan-regional geographies, the Thames Gateway, the Midlands Engine, etc. We then did growth deals, again that word deal at the heart of things, letting places tell us where they would spend pooled capital budgets on devolution. And then the Treasury did the Manchester devolution deal, and as others have already said, we've had a run of devolution deals post-election. And I think that all culminates next year in the May 2017 elections. I don't think the turnout will suffer, not least because they're being rolled together with local government elections. But I think that is a seminal political moment for this agenda, and as we just heard, there may be more mayoral deals to add to that collection that have already been announced. Second thing, so just to say something about deals, you know, it's the deal-making process at the heart of devolution, which I think gives rise to some of the, I'm not even sure they're concerns, but questions that people raise about the complexity, about the accountability. But deal-making necessarily means a conversation. It's place-based, it can be informal, and it is a way of our ministers achieving for places what they say they want to achieve themselves. And I think most people would recognise the sort of universal target-driven approach had reached its kind of zenith and I think run out of road. So deal making, that dialogue, really at the heart of the agenda. I won't repeat all the figures about numbers of deals, etc., but suffice to say 27% of the English population now in areas that will be covered by a mayor, and 5 out of the 8 core cities now have devolution deals of mayoral governance coming, with the others in very active discussion. We've passed the Localism Act, so the law is now set. Again, it's very permissive, it's a framework, but a really important milestone and not resisted at all. And I might, because I'm thinking what might I leave Will to say in his talk, I might let Will talk about the sort of policy contents of the deal, but wide-ranging across growth and across public services. And I think the deals can be summed up by doing 3 things. They're trying to achieve 3 things. One is the strengthened leadership, so it's the accountability that is at the heart of greater devolution, both of power and money. It's providing a geographic scale to pursue economic growth that hasn't existed in such strong forms, and it's about the public service integration and efficiency agenda. In terms then of Whitehall and the unit, I mean, I head a joint team, and for real, I mean, there are lots of Whitehall faces that I recognise here as well as others, but running a 2-department team is an interesting thing because the Whitehall systems don't talk to each other especially well, and we have to make that every day, from the policy integration, the accounting officer accountability, through to I, despite being the director, still have to walk to the printer and plug my printer into the cable because I run on a biz IT system in a DCLG building. So Whitehall integration has a little way to go. But at the heart of this is a shift to a place-based focus, which we brought 2 departments together. We work incredibly closely with Will's team, and I think people from other departments in the room would recognise that ever greater integration. I was going to read a quote from the Chancellor just to chuck in a bit of resistance. In his, I think just before the election, he said, "There are so many forces working against this kind of thing. Literally no one wants you to succeed. It is in everyone's interest that powers rest where they are at the moment. The forces of inertia in government are incredibly strong." And for us, that's why it's so important actually to be working with the Treasury on this agenda to try and make progress. Where agendas don't have the Treasury sponsorship, I think it's inevitably slower. But that quote from the Chancellor, I think, is a reminder that although there's a consensus on this agenda, there are plenty of people who are, if not hostile, then resistant and concerned to see it do well. Other consequences for Whitehall, I've emphasised already the kind of place-based approach. This really, at its heart, is about having place-based conversations across a wide range of policies. I think the issues of accountability and the role of accounting officers don't go away. There's a very healthy debate. Jeremy Hayward and Nick McPherson gave evidence to the PAC last week. The NAO, who are represented here, are doing 2 reports, one on local enterprise partnerships and local growth and one on the devolution deal landscape, and we benefit actually from that scrutiny and holding us to account. But at the heart is a tension between knowing every single piece of information and at the same time letting go. And then my final point is the tension, I think, also between innovation and differentiation. So the people most resistant to devolution talk about the Swiss cheese problem. How can we possibly run national services if you take chunks out? But the enthusiasts say, well, we see experimentation and new approaches and join up and efficiency. And that debate runs right the way through. Will it result in more or fewer senior bureaucrats in Whitehall? Who knows? We should have that debate. But I just wanted to give you an overview of what it looks like from my position, the importance on growth and that kind of evolutionary journey, the emphasis on deal making and conversation, and a few very top level thoughts on what it means sort of doing my job in Whitehall. So thank you very much.
Brilliant. Thanks very much, Tom. It was a really helpful run through of how we've got to where we've got to and some of the challenges ahead. But over to you, Will.
Thanks, folks. I'm sorry that I was late. It's really rude. It turns out it's the week before the budget, and there's one or two things going on, so I apologise. But then the Treasury traditionally about 10 minutes late anyway, so I've just got this budget excuse that I'm wheeling out today. I won't talk very long because it'd be interesting to hear people's thoughts, because I know in the room there's lots of people that are quite expert in their own right about all of this, so it'd be much more interesting perhaps to have a conversation than to listen to me drone on. But I was going to say three things. One, a bit about, I wasn't actually going to talk about policy stuff particularly, but thank you for leaving me a chunk. Well, I'm very happy to talk about that if that's of interest. Three things. One is a bit about the mechanics of how deals come about, because I think that is something that people don't feel they know enough about, and we can just, I mean, there's no sort of mystique behind it. It's sort of pretty processy, but I think sometimes that's just quite helpful. What happens when it works well? So I've been involved in all the 6 deals that we've done in this Parliament, and any more that might be coming. I've sort of led from the Treasury's perspective, so sort of a couple of observations about what works well, and then finally the where next for the agenda and so on. So those are the three things. I mean, just on how they come about in process terms and the respective roles of DCLG and the Treasury. I mean, as Tom says, and we do work incredibly well together. We would say that, wouldn't we, especially if we were sitting on the same platform next to each other. But actually, it is some of the best Whitehall working that I've ever seen in the time that I've been in Whitehall. And DCLG do a hell of a lot of the legwork. They are the people the relationship managers that are based not in SW1 but out and about around the country, tend to have relationships with their local authorities and the LEPs and other opinion formers. And those relationship managers, those regional bit, if you like, of DCLG is absolutely vital in the early stages. And quite often it starts with a bunch of local authorities talking to their BizLocal colleagues and talking about what they want out of their deal, and the BizLocal colleagues who all work for Tom giving them a sense check as to what the government might want and making progress. And that can be incredibly quick progress, and sometimes it takes longer. It just depends on a case-by-case basis. And so DCLG will tend to get a place to a certain place, if that makes sense. They'll get them so far, and then the Treasury's got this reputation for being really nasty and tough, and then they bring them to the Treasury and we're mean and say we can't afford it and things like that. But DCLG are always in the room. The Treasury join the show a little bit later on. They might join discussions with myself or one or two or three people in my team, and we just go through a places asks. We go through some of the things that government want, and we thrash it out. Ultimately, then quite soon, if it's going well, there are political level meetings between leadership of local authorities and the commercial secretary, Jim O'Neill, and or Greg Clark. That can deal with any of the tough issues that we are facing as officials. But sort of when we're moving at pace, what actually happens is we just start drafting in the room. So we give both Whitehall officials and local government officials or representatives, LEPs, the ability and the mandate to go and negotiate, and that's really, really important. It's really important, obviously, that those two sets of officials then bring back their conclusions to their respective principles, to the Chancellor and Jim O'Neill and Greg Clark in our case, and the local political leadership of the local authority, and they can say no at that stage or yes, but there isn't just a process, and we're in a room in the Treasury trying to thrash it out and agree what each side can accept. And then the objective is to boil it down to 2 or 3 issues through official level negotiations. They can be quite intense, they can be quite long, but they're good fun. And then the politicians will meet again and dot the I's and cross the T's and hey presto, we have a deal. So I know there's some sort of confusion or questions about process, but actually it's not that complicated. There's no great mystique. It's if you're a bit of local government that wants a devolution deal, start with BizLocal and have a look at the deals that have been done to date, and we can get cracking, because there's no bit of the country that's off limits or where we're not interested in proposals. What happens when it works well? I'd say two things. One, that the proposals from places are specific. So quite often we get proposals that say we want to empower place X to deliver, to grow the economy, get more people in work, have health, happiness, prosperity, a clean environment, and happiness for all forevermore, which is great, and we all support that. It fails. Simon Hogarth had a rule of reverse absurdity, where the reverse is patently absurd, it's not really worth saying. So it's like getting away from that high-level message, which is okay, we can include a high-level message, but it's just not very useful when you're trying to devolve specific powers, and ultimately we need to, and I'm sorry to be bureaucratic, but we need to translate these things into orders which lay before Parliament and written by Parliamentary Council, and there's no room for imprecision in Parliamentary Council's world, and nor should there be, because if there's imprecision, then you lose accountability, and this is serious stuff. So trying to make proposals as specific as possible. We want to take over that budget or that power or that policy area with statutory duties, without whatever it is. That works really well. And the second thing that's important is trust and cooperation, and being able to have an honest, candid conversation. Jim O'Neill's very fond of saying that both Whitehall and places have to get out of their comfort zones, and I think it's a really good phrase. But to do that, you have to have candid and private discussions. And I've talked to people as part of these deals where I've completely trusted the opposite number to go back to their authority and understand my perspective and try and move things on a bit. And then I've also read a so-called version of what I've said in the LGC, in the Local Government Chronicle, the next day, and I think that's not quite right. I didn't say that, you misinterpreted me, and that just doesn't help anyone, because then trust is lost, and then there needs to be that relationship. And partly because the places with which we do deals, once we've done a deal, that's not the end of it. I'll talk a bit more about this in a moment, but we see a lot of them, and so maintaining the relationship is really, really important, and so getting off on the right foot. And the third and final thing I was going to say was just about outcomes. And the thing that's amazed me about this agenda in the last year or so, and actually a bit prior to that, is the pace of change. And many of you in this room will have a better sense of that than I do, but it feels to me like local authorities that were sitting next to each other in geographical terms for many years and never talked to each other and had age-old animosities because of this hill or that river or whatever, are now coming together and burying the hatchet and working together and starting to think about their functional economic area at a rate that just wasn't happening previously. And that's incredibly exciting. It gives rise to huge opportunity, and you can achieve so much more, I think, when you have a sort of slightly bigger, more sensible geography. So we see a lot of that. That's fantastic. Ministers have been very, very clear that they don't see the deal document as the end of the story. It's not like, that's it, we shake hands, ever so nice to get to know you, and that's it. And as I was saying previously, both Tom and I are sort of in daily, weekly contact with all the areas that we have done deals with. As we do more, we expect to be in daily contact with those places. We expect, not least when there is a bunch of elected mayors in May 17, for them to be knocking at our doors saying, we haven't gone far enough, you've forgotten this power, and so on. And we don't regard that as a sign of failure, we regard it as a sign of success. So this is iterative. We get criticised sometimes for not being bold enough, and equally for sort of going too far too quickly. That may be a sign we've got it about right. But I think whatever you think of that, what is clear is this is not necessarily the end of the story. There's more to come on this whole agenda. And the final thing I just wanted to say is deals are the sort of the flagship, and they're really, really important. And but it's not just about deals. So the Chancellor announced 100% business rate retention for local government in his conference speech in October. That gives local government an extra £13 billion of revenue. Now, things are tough at the moment, so we need to find some policy responsibilities to match up to that 13 billion to go with it. Quite what goes with it is a huge strategic question. The government's suggested a few things that it's considering, but we'll be consulting extensively over the next few months about which powers, which policy responsibilities will be devolved to match that 13 billion. That's across local government. That's not just for places with devolution deals. Question, can we have a so-called variable geometry? So could we go further with places with deals? Well, quite possibly. But that's a really profound shift in the way that we organise ourselves. So it's a big opportunity. And there are other instances as well that might pertain to deals, but might also go beyond deals. So we've got a very, very clear statement of intent on health and social care integration, for example. And we think that's a good thing. We want it to feel like one service more so than it does today. Do you need a devolution deal to come to us? And it's DH's lead, but jointly with a proposal on health and social care integration? No, absolutely not. So we may be able to go further or want to pilot things with deal areas or so on. But the message is we're open for big, bold ideas. This agenda is sort of changing and evolving, and it's a really, I'm kind of convinced that it's always quite an exciting time to work in public policy just because it's quite interesting. But this feels like a particularly interesting time to work in public policy because we've got a set of ministers and a chancellor that is up for making this agenda last and seeing some quite profound changes.
Brilliant, thank you, and really interesting insight into that process and what's sort of happening with all the deal making that's going on at the moment. I just want to start, before opening up to the floor, just to ask Will and Tom what you think the key challenges for Whitehall in the next 6 months, particularly in terms of implementation of all of this. So we've talked a lot about the deal making, but as areas are actually moving to doing lots of work with different departments across Whitehall to make it happen, what do you think the key challenges for Whitehall in the next 6 months?
Shall I? I think there is a sort of prosaic capacity point. As Will says, the deal document sets, it's a bit like a white paper, except there are 7 white papers and there are going to be more to come. So the sort of follow through on implementation and capacity, including the capacity of local places, how able are they to do their side of the deal, I think that's manageable. Other things, I'm not sure, I think there's just a big job, and actually I'd written on sort of follow-up points to make during the question and answer. This point about excitement and momentum, I think it's really an exciting agenda. I've worked on lots of different things, but it has a kind of unstoppable force. It motivates people, the people working on it, work hard, but feel that really we're driving a very significant change. So they're sort of prosaic things rather than fundamentals, I think, in terms of challenge.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think it's difficult for departments, of course it is, because there's a bespoke nature and we're not doing it in every place, and so they're making sure that there's the capacity to deliver that we said we would, but ministers sure as hell aren't going to take, there's not enough capacity to do it as a reasonable response, so we've just got to make it work, and we will make it work because we have to. I think it's there, it's just we have to make sure that we're sufficiently organised to make it happen.
Great, thank you. So we're going to open up to questions from all of you. Please do wait for the microphone before you ask a question and say your name and organisation, and keep your comments and questions brief, please, so we can get lots in. And if you are sitting in the room next door, because we have lots of people here today, please do come in if you'd like to ask a question. So I've got one right at the back there, one here, and one there. So if we take those 3 first, starting here and then we'll come to the back.
Thanks. My name's John Cartledge. I'm just a citizen in the street, so forgive me for the naivety of my question. But what I'd like to understand a little better is this preoccupation with directly elected mayors. That's an option that's been around on the table for a long time. The take-up rate has been extremely limited. Indeed, in some areas it's gone back rather than forwards. Why is Whitehall obsessed with that to the point that that's a deal breaker, that's a precondition for getting anything else. Because there's no source for the goose, source for the gander principle here. Nobody in Whitehall has been directly elected. Why is it so important that your partners in local government should accept that principle?
And then we'll just take them in a group of three. So this question, please.
Is this switched on? Yes, I think it is. Alan Howarth, House of Lords. My question follows very naturally from the last question. I wanted to ask Tom and Will how they anticipate in their continuing conversations and relationships with these new devolved entities that they will get beyond the elected mayors. And these elected mayors are going to loom very large on the political landscape. It would seem that the creation of an elected mayor is a charter for populism and grandstanding. We've heard about informal governance. Well, there has been a certain impromptu and even maverick character about the performance in office of some of our best-known elected mayors, who I don't need to name. But the other local authorities that form part of this consortium will have much muter voices and probably a weaker capacity. And I just wonder how Whitehall's going to deal with those. Second question, how bold do you anticipate Whitehall being in the future in giving these new devolved entities not just notional independence, but substantial resources? And Will touched on this in what he had to say about business rates. But Whitehall has, on the whole, been very happy to trammel very tightly the financial capacity of local government. Got rather bold recently where Scotland's concerned. It seems really quite an indulgent view of what the resources ought to be available to Scotland. But what do you anticipate will happen about enabling the devolved institutions of government really to have the means to carry out the policies to which you may give your blessing?
And the third question was just over here. Thank you. It's switched on.
Oh, Tom Lawrence, freelance in local government finance and devolution. Two quick ones. Dr. Ayres was talking about the difference between the informal and the formal approach, and you outlining some of the impacts of the two. And you mentioned the informal can have more of a personal element to it. And it made me think, I'd be interested in views on to what extent that informal arrangement can carry forward and become continuity when there's a change of people involved, and how it can open up to community involvement in the process, and how it can be robust. And the other question was that Will and Tom mentioned variable geometries and the Swiss cheese problem. The title is Whitehall in a devolved. What role for Whitehall in a devolved system of in England? So I'm thinking post-Devo deals, maybe 2030 or something. What planning do you think the departments have to undertake to prepare for that kind of situation at that later date in time?
Great, thank you. Some great questions there. Sarah, did you want to start us off on that one?
This thing about informal being very much linked to the individual. I think there is a danger that when people move, that capital that's been created, perhaps between institutions or localities, is lost. And I think that's a particular danger. But when I was speaking to Whitehall colleagues last year outside the commission work, I posed that to them. And they were saying that there's always movement in the civil service, in Whitehall in particular. And actually that capital's lost anyway, even if you're working through formal structures. And they were trying to mitigate against that through having proper formal handovers, developing relationships with people to try and protect against the sort of loss of capital when people move. I think your question about whether informal can be extended to communities, I think, is an interesting one. At the moment, it seems that informal governance is very much focused on people at the heart of the process, the core group of insiders. And my sense is that there has been a lot of trust generated between, as you were rightly saying, between Whitehall departments and localities, being able to work off script quietly, without media scrutiny and without some of the attention, has led to much greater trust building. I think the challenge is then to have that spread out perhaps towards the periphery, to begin to engage local stakeholders more in the process. But informal ways of working certainly have the potential to do that. I think it needs to be spread out a little bit more outside the core through broader consultation engagement with public bodies and stakeholders.
Great, thank you. Do you want to pick up on some of the issues around directly elected mayors and fiscal devolution?
Yeah, shall I do mayors and you do the money? I mean, mayors, there is quite a simple answer, and in the end, it's an answer that not everyone agrees with, but for the transfer of significant power and money, which is undoubtedly at the heart of devolution deals, there needs to be clearer accountability, and the government has chosen for that to be in the form of directly elected mayors. They're different to the previous mayors, i.e. Pure local authority mayors. They will have a much bigger footprint geographically, they will have a much bigger mandate electorally, and then there are checks and balances because they will be the mayor of a combined authority, not just a freestanding individual. So it's a very deliberate policy decision which the Chancellor has been absolutely clear about. Does it mean there is no devolution for places that don't have a mayor? No, because the Cornwall deal shows actually in the case of a strong unitary authority there are steps towards devolution that ministers have been prepared to sign up to, but the fundamental deal here is stronger single accountability matched with significant devolution of power from Whitehall to the combined authority level.
Yeah, I'll just say, I mean, I think it is slightly different this time to previous mayoral experiments, and I mean, I mean, as Tom says, there's not necessarily a national consensus about this, but it would appear to me as an observer that, you know, London has more of a voice having a mayor. It's had, like, the last two mayors have been very different political persuasions, very different views, but they've both been strong leaders in their own right, and it feels like having an integrated transport system that works really quite well now, that reports to one individual ultimately, is policy progress. That's something that we're looking to replicate in these devolution deals, to have a transport for London and in other places, because it seems to work quite well in London. I mean, just on the local government get less power, I don't think they do. I mean, if your counterfactual is that nothing happens, they certainly don't. And quite a lot of the combined authorities that we are working with will appoint leaders of local government as members of cabinet, is how they describe them. So you might have a leader of a particular local authority that is the go-to person on skills, or the responsible person for skills or transport or housing or whatever it is. Now, the mayor's still got a role, a very important role, but it's clear to me, even with a mayor, that individual local authority leaders who form part of the combined authority have more powers and more responsibilities than they did previously. In terms of the money, I mean, I think we see that local government's done a really good job at delivering savings and maintaining services, and satisfaction's actually gone up in the last 5 years. Now, we know it's difficult and we know it's challenging, but they have done an excellent job. I think we think that once we give more responsibilities, more budgets, more control, there is an opportunity for local government to carry on delivering better public services for the same amount or less money. I think that is something that can be done. That is what public service reform is ultimately about. And by empowering a mayor and a combined authority to take on more functions, there are certainly efficiencies that can be found and new opportunities to do things differently. Now, the key thing in this is that nobody's forcing it on anyone. So if you don't want it, if you don't feel you're up for the extra policy responsibility, or you don't want the control of the additional budgets, you don't have to take them. It's just where places think they can do a better job than we do in SW1, we're really up for hearing about it. And to me, that seems like a very pragmatic way forward.
Great. Jo, did you want to come back on the mayor's point?
Yeah, so I think just on mayors, I think it's an important point that the current set of mayors that are being created are a very, very different model to previous. They're a chair of a combined authority rather than leader of a specific organisation. And I think one of the things that's really important there is to remember what the combined authorities are. So lots of the combined authorities are groups of local authorities that have traditionally not worked particularly well together. There are cultural differences between those areas, and actually there's a strong argument for saying that institution of a group of leaders of combined authority local authorities is fairly far removed from citizens, and having some kind of mechanism that allows a citizen voice in at that combined authority level is going to be incredibly important for maintaining that structure in the future. So having a mayor who is directly elected sitting on that may be quite important. And I think it also slightly answers this gentleman's point down here that if one of the challenges with the current devolution deals is that they're reliant on personal relationships, you need to build in mechanisms somehow that will allow those areas to maintain their voice vis-a-vis the centre into the future. And a mayor who is able to make the case for his area, his or her area, into the future will be a very important kind of mechanism for accruing those powers in the future. So I think it's a kind of a longer term point as well as the short term.
Great, thank you. Can I take the next set of questions? I've got one here, and then one here. I'll come back to you. Thanks.
Thank you. Vernon Bogdanor, King's College London. We've been told that there's devolution to city regions and unitary authorities like Cornwall, but could a local authority which was neither of those, say Oxfordshire where I used to live, could that get a deal if it wished? And if so, would it have to reorganise to become unitary or join up with other authorities? And secondly, what are the criteria for when the deal requires a mayor? Cornwall doesn't require a mayor, so under what circumstances is a mayor required and when not? And thirdly, what can be devolved and what isn't to be devolved? Michael Heseltine's name was mentioned, but he talked of partnership. But you can't necessarily have partnership if you have different political majority locally. I mean, suppose one of these authorities wants to build a new grammar school, for example, or with health being devolved, they want to charge for a visit to the doctor, or set up their own local national health service tax. Would they be allowed to do that? And if not, are we going to get a precise statement of what is being devolved and what is retained at the centre? The sort of thing we've got in the devolution legislation for Scotland and Wales. Now, I mentioned grammar schools, but skills, as I understand it, is being devolved, but education is being centralised and having regional commissioners for that. I mean, is this not a case for joined-up government? I mean, should there not be devolution in education as well if skills are being devolved? And finally, I mean, the question of the mandate. I mean, mayors have a much lower turnout than central government. I mean, in general, and our turnout in local government is one of the lowest in Western Europe. And therefore, whatever people say about decentralisation, they don't support it. Now, is the government considering proposals to make local government more effective and a higher turnout in local authorities? So I think there are a lot of loose ends. I think there are a lot of loose ends.
Can we come to this question now, please? Thanks.
Thank you very much. Sam Windett from URSA. I think it's interesting that this policy level discussion about transferring powers is quickly becoming a very practical discussion in government departments about future programmes. I'm thinking of the Work and Health programme as one and how that will work. Is Whitehall building in assurances around value for money of future public services and about transparency and that you're getting the bang for your buck in the future, and if so, how? Because I think one thing that Whitehall can do is in the future assure that you're comparing like for like and getting that value for money out of the services.
Great, thank you. And the final question here, please.
Thank you. Sam Thomas from Making Every Adult Matter, which is a coalition of national charities, Mind, Homeless Link and Clinks. I was really struck by what Tom said about the issue of capacity in local areas, so not just in Whitehall to manage these deals, but local areas to deliver them. I would certainly hope that local voluntary sector organisations are a big part of that capacity, and certainly in areas like health and social care, we already see lots of services being provided by voluntary sector organisations. In the areas that I have talked to about devolution, there's a great deal of enthusiasm about the opportunities that are there for charities and community organisations to engage. There's also a degree of confusion about the best way to engage with those deals. And I wonder, as we get into this kind of implementation stage, is there anything that Whitehall could be doing in terms of the ways that these devolution deals are working out and pressure that could be applied on how voluntary sector organisations can engage the best with the deals that have been done and also make sure they're involved in the discussions that the deals are coming down the line?
Great, thank you. A big range of issues there. Will, should we start with you?
Yeah, I mean, so Fernand raises a lot of issues. I mean, I think the principal thing on your question of Oxfordshire is that we have no prescribed formula about who a deal is open to. So if any county, be it a unitary authority or a two-tier authority, wants to come to us with a proposal in coalition with other counties, in coalition with a city, if you take, I'm from Wiltshire, if you took Wiltshire and Swindon, if they want to do it, if Wiltshire want to work with Buckinghamshire or Somerset, all of that is open. So there is absolutely no prescription. You'd expect us to want deals to be over a functional economic area. Most places, so do the places that approach us, because it's in everyone's mutual interest. That's clearly the sensible thing to do. If we got some ridiculous geography that didn't reflect the functional economic area, would we raise that as a concern and have that as part of the discussion? Yes, absolutely we would. But the key thing is, the rule is there isn't a bunch of prescribed rules on geography, because ministers feel that were we to try and enforce it from here, there wouldn't be any local ownership, and then ultimately this very important endeavour would be less likely to succeed. None of the deals that we have done thus far give a combined authority or a mayor the power to set up a grammar school or start charging for the health service. So, we're quite careful about what we devolve. Theoretically, I guess it's one could devolve absolutely everything apart from foreign policy, and that would be that. But none of the deals go anywhere near that far. So I think that's not a likely prospect. In terms of the mandate and turnout, I mean, clearly everyone would like to see a higher turnout in local government elections. I mean, I'm not really speaking as an official here, but my sort of personal take on that is that given that the things that we are devolving matter, the elections matter, you'll drive higher turnout because the job is such a big one. So I hope that one way of getting people to care and getting people to engage is by giving up the powers that we are. Or maybe they feel that the powers aren't substantial enough, in which case that can be another means of improving turnout. And the question about value for money, yes, it really matters to us, and you would expect us to say as much. I mean, we've put some gain share funding, in which we call the jargon for some money into these deals. They're subject to a strict economic appraisal that we are putting out to tender at the moment, making sure that the funding that we put in drives and facilitates local economic growth. So we care about that hugely. It's absolutely right that we have ability to evaluate and appraise the policy decisions that we are making, and we've built that into the deals. And sorry, I've rather covered all of them. But on your point on the voluntary sector, I mean, yes. I mean, I don't know if it's for central government. We obviously see a big role for the voluntary sector. That's part of a mixed provision. That makes absolute sense. I don't know if it's central government's role to turn up and tell the new mayor of Manchester, you should provide your services in the following ways. But I would fully expect the fact that Manchester have got a whole bunch of powers they didn't have previously, that it's actually much easy for you as a provider to get in there and go and talk to them yourselves. We're very happy to facilitate a conversation, but actually it might just be better if you did it, and hopefully mixed provision of services is more likely, more possible by a more devolved structure. What have I missed there, Tom?
Tom, do you want to pick
I'll
up on
just
anything?
add to that last point. I mean, it's worth remembering that Greg Clark, as Secretary of State in DCLG, was also the Minister for Decentralisation, who had a huge role in cementing the community rights agenda under the last government. So don't read into sort of attention moved away from that towards just sort of metro mayor geography. Actually, I think it's baked into the DNA of what we're trying to achieve. But it's interesting because I had a meeting last week with several of the biggest housing association chief executives, and they were asking the very same question: what does this mean for us as housing associations? To which my answer was, as Will has just said, really you need to be engaged with those places that are going to have mayoral elections, and as the candidates start to become clear, they are the people who I think, whatever the turnout, will start making the political weather both in their place and on this agenda in a year's time, or just over a year's time. And for sure they will be back to say we want devolution deal 2.0 or the next wave of powers, because we can achieve these things. Whether they get grammar schools or not, who knows, but I think that debate will come. So I think whatever sector you're in, the political event is the mayoral election. The candidates will start to emerge, and that's where this will become reality, and that's a conversation that takes place through places, but my team is here to help with the kind of national level engagement as people grapple with this. And I would say housing association chief execs were asking the very same question, so it's not exclusive to one group of people or the other. I think everyone is just beginning to realise this is real now. The legislation is in place, the deals are in place. We've got a year and a bit to prepare.
Sarah? Yeah, I'd like to pick up on Vernon's point where you used the phrase lots of loose ends, you know, and we talked about that as part of the commission and raised the question about whether some of these loose ends could be tightened. I think there was no view that for a highly prescriptive approach, you know, based on loads of guidelines, but what became apparent was people that gave evidence to the commission were saying that things that were definitely on the agenda, and perhaps more importantly, things that were definitely not on the agenda, emerged through the deal-making process. And this meant that lots of local areas wasted lots of valuable time, perhaps trying to create a proposal that was never going to fly. And there's a question about whether there could be stronger signals from, but I think guidance is perhaps the wrong word, but whether there might be stronger signals from Whitehall departments clarifying some more of this up front. When we spoke to central government figures, they were very reluctant to have this formulaic, prescriptive approach. But it does raise a question about the capacity issues, mentioned the other side of the room, where you know, if you're Manchester, you are ahead of the game, you know what you want, and I think that deal-making process works. Other areas that perhaps haven't got the slack resources or the research capacity to invest into what they may or may not want, some of these early signals might help them and avoid wasting some valuable resources.
Jo?
And I think our work has found that entirely, as well as this question around that lots of local areas have around areas that are policy areas that they felt were on the table, and actually when it comes to negotiation are not on the table. And to us that leads us to a conclusion where we think that there's a value to the response that I'm sure both of our two central government contributors would come back on, which is to say we don't want to be too prescriptive, but is there a happy medium where central government could be a bit better at articulating the kind of high-level objectives it's trying to achieve through devolution that leads local areas towards the kinds of things that will be productive in negotiation rather than things that aren't on the table. Two other very quick things. One, I think there's an interesting parallel that Vernon drew between the Scottish and Welsh devolution settlements and the differences, for anyone who knows about the differences between those settlements, between the conferred and a reserved powers model. Obviously we're moving towards a situation in England where it is the conferred powers model writ large, and there are messy edges in that relationship between England and Wales, between the UK and Wales actually I should say, and those messy edges are going to be all over the place in this new landscape. And I think to us that leads us to a place where we're saying, okay, well the key thing to fix here is how Whitehall deals with that messiness, rather than creating a load of settlements that restrict to very specific policy domains and are incredibly clear about where the competence ends and begins. And then the final point on charities and capacity. To us at least, I mean, we're talking here about how Whitehall changes, but the guide deals with how you can judge whether local areas are ready for devolution. And to us, I think one thing Whitehall could be doing is looking for clear evidence that local areas have engaged very widely with their voluntary sectors, their local businesses, as a mark of quality in bids. But if devolution is a response, or if one of the things that people claim the benefit of devolution is that it responds to central government not traditionally being as good as some people would like in consultation and kind of adapting policy to suit local needs, then local areas really have to be demonstrating that they're doing that much better in order to make the case for devolved services. So really we'd argue that in local areas they should be actively going out and talking to their voluntary sector provider base as well as businesses, citizens themselves as a way of developing these deals that are workable in the long term.
Great, thank you. I'm going to take Chair's prerogative to ask a question myself, which is, what role do you think that Whitehall should have in kind of sharing learning between areas? As we move into the kind of implementation phase, it's almost like we're setting up a policy laboratory across England where people will be innovating and experimenting. So what role is there for the centre in helping to share learning across local areas? Then we have a question here, that gentleman there, and one here, and then we'll take a final round after that. Sorry, just behind you.
Thank you. John Newham, teacher of politics. And I wonder just how much popular demand there is for devolution in England. I remember there was a referendum in 2004 in the North East, complete damp squib. And then about 4 years ago, I believe only Bristol was the only city to actually say, yes, please, we'd like a mayor. But my main point is this: if we're going to have a form of devolution, is it not inevitably logical that the Treasury must lose some power? Because if devolution is going to be meaningful, they must be able to have their own fiscal powers. Otherwise, there might be some little quarrel comparable to the one in Scotland. I just wondered whether last week's agreement in Scotland might have some relevance on this issue.
Great, and then the question just there. Yes, that's you. Yeah.
Yes, Hartley Miller, Chester University. I think moving on from that very thought, who is going to be the arbiter of whether something is failing? We have failing schools, failing hospitals. So that's the first question. Is that simply a central government decision by one ministry? Given that the ministries have specific responsibilities and you're talking about integration of services, it's quite likely that spaghetti that has been formed within a local area is going to be very hard to unpick. So if one central department decides that social care is not working, it's not entirely that department which is going to have to pick up the pieces. And finally, I think the obvious question when you enter into any contract, perhaps even a marriage contract, is to know exactly how you're going to end it if you have to. Where is that defined?
We're doing some work at the Institute on failure in public services at the moment, and it's certainly an issue that we also raised in our guide to devolution deals. Jo, shall I start with you this time?
Yeah, I don't feel I'm particularly qualified to weigh in on what HMT should lose. I think I'll leave that to Will. I think I agree on failure. One of the arguments for having a directly elected mayor would be, I suppose, that you can more directly allocate kind of responsibility both for success and failure with elected officials who represent the whole area that you've devolved to. Obviously, there's a question there about salience and whether that's about whether people directly kind of blame or give credit to those officials. So we'll have to see whether that happens. But certainly in the past, where we've seen failures of devolution policy, it's where that responsibility hasn't been correctly allocated down to a local level, and ministers have felt the need to step in and take powers back as a way of resolving those problems.
Sarah, thank you. Yeah, picking up on that point about failure, it ties into one of the findings from the Commission, where it was really unclear about how implementation would be monitored and how success or failure would be judged. And I don't think there's any clear steer on that yet. So until there is, it's going to be hugely difficult to identify what failure looks like and then what might be done about it. But I remember when I was speaking to Whitehall colleagues in 2012, there was a quote from someone who said, devolution will be a success when it ceases to be the minister's fault that a locality's failed. And I think we're moving into that direction now. I don't know if we've quite got there, but without having these clear signals on what failure looks like and how it might be judged, I think that question's really difficult to answer. Jo, in response to yours about what is the role for Whitehall in terms of sharing learning, again picks up on a finding from the Commission where it seemed to be that Whitehall colleagues were under the impression that core cities were sharing lots of information about the devolution deals. They were sharing their best practice. But when we spoke to local actors, quite the reverse was said to be true. They were very protective of their deal-making process or the cards that they had, and they wanted to try and maintain their first mover advantage and were not sharing with their local counterparts. And part of one of the findings of the Commission is that perhaps more work needs to be done in this area to share local knowledge in a more purposeful way. And there might be a role not only for Whitehall, but also associations like the Local Government Association in helping localities share best practice to try and get to the real innovation and entrepreneurship that Will and Tom have been talking about.
Great, thank you. Tom?
Where do you want me to start? I mean, sharing's interesting, because the easiest thing in the world to do is to sort of say Whitehall, this great thing, they in Whitehall must sort of produce some good practice guidance. And I'm not sure that actually I really believe in that. Pages and pages of guidance and practice are produced. Is that really the way you change the way the country is run? So I think we have a role, but I don't think we should immediately step into that space, because at the heart of this whole debate is trying to change the way the country runs, and we want to see some of that guarded secrecy, which might be inevitable in the process of deal making, but actually as the core cities network and the LGA come to grapple with some of these intractable problems, they look to each other and themselves to solve those problems. And that's quite a purist response, but I use it because I think that's the mentality that sits a little behind some of the agenda. Popular assent, I mean, Durham is interesting. So Durham ran a poll, £200,000 it cost them, having signed the deal to consult residents. And actually the results show a wide degree of enthusiasm for devolution. They published the results, I think they published them anyway a couple of weeks ago. There's an interesting thing about referendums generally, and who knows what we see on the 23rd of June, but that they tend to favour the status quo. So the previous mayoral elections under the coalition government, well, they never got to election because they asked a referendum question first. And I think it follows from everything that Will and I have said that the fiscal devolution debate will continue to come back. We see progress, obviously, on the business rate retention policy and some of the freedoms that are being given. But if I was a mayor elected in a place, the first thing I'd be doing is saying, right, you've given me the powers, now give me the money. And I think that will follow on from 2017. So I think, and I hope that answers your questions. Failure, and then I might let Will pick up whatever else is left. But failure, we shouldn't pretend in any of this debate that we're sweeping away the power of the inspectorates on services where actually the individual winners and losers go down to needy households. And so Ofsted, the Care Quality Commission, will continue to have an important role. And you're right that the more we integrate services, maybe it becomes a greater complexity to unpick things, but there's a vital role in safeguarding the basic standards that people should expect. But at the same time, supercharging that local accountability. So there is not some jumping off point on May 2017 where everything is different and sort of everyone fends for themselves. I think you'll see a kind of continuity and change which tries to embrace exactly that risk. I'll let Will mop up the...
Thanks, Tom. I mean, I agree with you on shared learning. I mean, the obvious answer to the question is yes, that sounds like a very sensible thing to do, but it may be that it doesn't need to be the government publishing some quite bland guidance that nobody really reads, and actually the people that are doing this work meeting regularly and having their own product, hasn't been drafted been for a cabinet right round and cleared by everyone and made to be not very interesting as a consequence. On the Treasury losing its powers, now here's a career limiting opportunity for me to get on. I mean, the thing that, again, I think it sounds like a sort of angle where we're being told we're not being ambitious enough, and as I say, sometimes we're told the opposite. Not just because I worked on it, but the business rate reform is a really significant fiscal shift. Now, it's only in 2013 that we said 50% of business rates will stay with local government, and now we can at least say that all money raised locally, both in the form of council tax and business rates, will stay locally. Now, business rates will carry on being redistributed to some extent around the country, but that's a really profound shift, and it makes it much more difficult in future for Whitehall to get its mitts on that money and determine how it's spent. The powers, the business rates work includes the ability for local authorities to cut rates if they so want to do so to try and attract more business into their area. It allows elected mayors to put them up for an infrastructure levy, providing there's the support of local businesses. So that's quite a big, bold step. The spending review included an adult social care council tax preset for extra spending on social care. So I think the Treasury's made quite a bold play already in that place. And as for the future, I'll leave that to my political masters, if I may.
Thank you. And then final questions. We had one over there and one here and one just there. And apologies to people I haven't managed to get to.
Thank you. My name's Felicity Dorman and I come from the Health Foundation. And I wanted to ask really about what Whitehall can do to sort of resist the centralising tendencies of, ministers, I guess, and also public's opinion. So national policy in healthcare at the moment is arguably getting much more centralised. So the financial crisis means there's a much greater grip on local services. And that is in tension, I think, with the devolution agenda and other efforts to get more local autonomy. So I wondered what thinking you guys had done about what that means and how that might be resisted or how that would work out.
Thank you. And one here? Just here, sorry.
Gavin Miller, Institution of Civil Engineers. We're publishing a report in June on devolution and infrastructure. And as part of that, the evidence gathering we're doing at the moment, we had a public opinion survey carried out last month. It showed overall there's a good understanding of devolution of people, and it's generally thought of to be positive. It's just devolution in England, I should say. But one of the questions also highlighted there's a strong desire for local referenda on the devolution deals. Now, given what we've said about local ownership, the poll in Durham, for example, do you think there is any merit in tying the referendum deals to referenda?
Great, thank you. And the final question was just over here. Thanks.
Thank you. Sam from the MJ. You mentioned earlier, Will, I think, about the need to find new policy responsibilities with the 13 billion rates retention. But it's not 13 billion new money, is it? It's just a reallocation of what they already get.
Currently, it wasn't previously in local government, that will be with local government by the end of the Parliament.
So have you done any thinking on what the new policy responsibilities would be?
Yeah, so the government said the things that sorry, shall I start with that one?
No, please do.
Does that make sense?
And then any other final comments as well, and
Fine.
we'll work our way this way.
Thank you. So we said that we're looking at there are sort of various grants that we're looking at phasing out to try and make the 13 billion fiscally neutral. Those include there's a big TfL capital grant, there's pension and benefit admin subsidy, public health is a clear candidate for being devolved because it's largely done by local authorities, play a big role in it already. Attendance allowance, where we've been very clear that we protect the benefit in quantum terms, but those are the four that we have announced that we're looking at, but we're consulting widely on what else fits. I think that's a big question. Would really welcome people's views on that because we have an open mind. So business rates are redistributed through the top-up and tariff system already. So Westminster raises an awful lot of business rates, and it doesn't get to keep all of those business rates because it would be quite a rich state in its own right if it did. And so the system of redistributing business rates within local government will be maintained.
And any other things, sorry to, just in the interest of time,
Yeah.
any other things you wanted to pick
Sorry,
up?
yeah. So health and social care, I mean, I don't know if I recognise the sort of centralising tendencies you talked about. I mean, I think the Manchester deal was quite a big, bold reform. It certainly felt like that from our end, but you're shaking your head. So,
And places that I have been in discussions with thus far have been quite nervous about taking on large swathes of the health agenda for obvious reasons. And we haven't sort of pushed it upon anyone because that's not how we're doing this. We are really up for further discussions, more work, and seeing how we can create an integrated system if places want it and it fits with the rest of our agenda. I mean, we talked a bit about referendums. I mean, I think the position there is that there's no stipulation from us. Places can do what they like. And if they want to have a referendum, that's up to them. If they want to consult people, that's up to them. But you know, it's a sort of, it's not really one for us. It's for the people that we're doing deals with. And the only sort of final thing I'd say, just in summary, is, well, one, thank you, because it's really interesting to hear the challenges and the perspectives and get a mirror held up. So that's really, really useful. But two, do sort of feel free to engage in this agenda. We're genuinely interested in what people have to think. As I say, I've mentioned the business rates consultation. Get in touch with combined authorities. Have a read of the deals that have been done. They're all online, so you can start to get a sense of the sort of thing that the sort of things we are doing. And if you've got more ideas and more thinking about what we've missed and where we haven't been ambitious enough or too ambitious, then do let us know, because this is a sort of new learning curve for all of us.
Great, thank you. Tom, final thoughts and reflections?
Yeah, I mean, just to sort of wrap up on those questions, I mean, I think what gets to the heart of your question about how can we help Whitehall resist, I think in the end is to make an agenda that is very clear now a success. The test is not over the next few weeks or months, it's actually, for me, over the next couple of years. And we will have mayors in place, as I've said several times, in May 17, and hopefully we will see more announced very soon. My only final concluding remark is a very self-interested one. We're always recruiting in my unit, which is one of the best places in Whitehall to work. If you're a Whitehall person, there are lots of badge holders here, then do apply or get in touch with me. If you're not in Whitehall, we're even more interested, because we want to make sure the Whitehall mentality is infused with outside expertise and input. So I'm on a biz email address, ironically, but email me and you can have a job.
Thanks, Tom. Sarah, any final thoughts?
Yeah, I just wanted to pick on Felicity's point about Whitehall centralising tendencies, and one of the stories that's come through for the 20 years that I've been looking at English devolution is a highly differentiated or different approach in terms of political enthusiasm for devolution, but also enthusiasm across departments. So in 2005, I wrote a paper looking at Whitehall's motives for decentralisation. I identified a set of leaders in transition and laggards across the departments, and I think that still remains. So when we had our launch event about the Commission last Thursday, there was a clear indication that some departments and some teams within departments are willing to play ball, others aren't, and I think that's still a big challenge.
Great. Jo?
Yeah, so the final things on resisting the centralising tendencies of ministers, I think, was the question, and the public. I don't know the answer to the public, so I'll leave that. But on ministers, I think one of the things is maintaining the strong leadership from ministers. As I said in my presentation, they're able to kind of cut across other cabinet ministers' desires to kind of do things. Obviously, our system incentivises ministers to have kind of big reforms and changes associated personally with them, and often that requires that they retain as many levers as possible. And one of the challenges in the past has been that reforms have been led out of DCLG, which has never had not often had a minister who was able to tell other departments where they can't, other ministers where they have to stop. Whereas with the leadership from both the Treasury and DCLG now, you'd hope that actually there are much better prospects for that. Finally, on the referenda in the future, I mean, I think, so one of the proposals in the 2012 mayoral elections was that you'd have shadow mayors and then have referendums on them to kind of turn on its head the status quo bias that Will talked about earlier. And I think there is quite a strong argument in the future to having referenda to confirm the kind of deals that are in place. And in fact, our work in the past has shown that referendum are a very good way of locking in place against Whitehall's desire to encroach back onto devolved territory deals that have been agreed. So it may well be something that comes up again in the future.
Great, thank you. Just to let you know that we're having 2 further events on this subject. We're having an event on fiscal devolution, mainly around Scotland and Wales on the 14th of March. And then we're having a further event in April looking at some of the areas that have got deals and hearing directly from them on what they're planning in terms of joining up local public services. So thank you very much for coming, and please join me in thanking our panellists.